At 2:17 on a cold Tuesday morning, Ethan Parker sat alone in his car outside a grocery store parking lot in Ohio, staring at a voicemail he had promised himself he would never listen to again. 3 years had passed since Amelia walked out his life. 3 years since he packed away the photographs, deleted the messages, and convinced everyone around him that he was doing just fine. His friends believed he had moved on. His family thought time had healed him. Even Ethan himself had started to believe it. But there was one thing he never had the courage to do. He never deleted her voice. And on that night, after 3 years of silence, after hundreds of lonely dinners and thousands of sleepless hours, he pressed play. What happened in the next few moments forced him to confront a truth he had spent years trying to escape. Because sometimes the greatest heartbreak isn't losing the person you love. Sometimes it's discovering that a part of you never really said goodbye. And what Ethan would eventually learn would change not only his life, but the lives of millions of people who have spent years asking themselves the same painful question. Why is it that some people move on while others remain prisoners of memories they cannot explain? For most people, love is supposed to have an ending. That's what we're told. People fall in love, they build memories together, and when things end, they heal and move forward. But life doesn't always follow the stories we were taught. Sometimes the goodbye happens long before the heart is ready. Sometimes the person leaves, but their absence stays behind. And sometimes, years later, in the middle of an ordinary night, a forgotten song, an old photograph, or a voice hidden inside a voicemail can reopen doors we thought had been locked forever. Ethan didn't know it yet, but the pain he had spent years trying to outrun wasn't a sign of weakness. It wasn't proof that he had failed. In fact, what researchers and psychologists have discovered about love, memory, and heartbreak reveals something far more surprising. Something that explains why certain people never truly leave us, why some wounds seem to follow us for decades, and why heartbreak can shape the rest of our lives without us even realizing it. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What makes Ethan's story remarkable isn't that he lost someone. Millions of people lose relationships every year. What makes his story remarkable is what happened long after everyone believed the story was over. Because Amelia wasn't his wife. She wasn't the mother of his children. They had only spent 4 years together. And yet, after 3 years apart, she still occupied a place inside his mind that no one else had been able to reach. He had tried dating again. He had buried himself in work. He had taken vacations, attended weddings, celebrated birthdays, and laughed with friends. On the outside, life continued. But in quiet moments, when the world slowed down and nobody was watching, memories always found their way back. And Ethan wasn't alone. Across America, millions of men between the ages of 45 and 64 quietly carry stories they rarely share. Stories of love they lost. Stories of mistakes they still regret. Stories they revisit in silence while pretending everything is okay. But what if the truth about heartbreak is completely different from what we've been taught? What if losing someone isn't actually the end of the story? And what if the greatest lessons about love only begin after everything falls apart? Because Ethan Parker was about to discover something that would force him to question everything he believed about relationships, memory, and the strange way the human heart refuses to forget. 3 years after Amelia walked away, Ethan Parker still couldn't answer the question that haunted him every night. It wasn't why she left. Time had slowly helped him accept that relationships end and people change. It wasn't even whether he could have done something differently. He had tortured himself with that question enough times to know there were no easy answers. No, the question that kept him awake wasn't about the breakup at all. It was much simpler and somehow much more painful. Why couldn't he forget? Why, after 3 years, after countless distractions, after birthdays, holidays, and entire seasons had come and gone, could the sound of Amelia's voice still stop him in his tracks? Why did certain songs immediately bring him back to memories he thought were buried? Why could he remember the exact sound of her laughter, but forget conversations he had the day before? And perhaps the most confusing question of all, Why did a woman who no longer shared his life still occupy a space inside his heart that nobody else had managed to reach? Ethan wasn't obsessed. He wasn't refusing to move on. In fact, he wanted nothing more than to finally make peace with the past. Yet some nights, without warning, memories appeared like old photographs hidden inside a drawer you forgot existed. And Ethan soon discovered he wasn't alone. Millions of people, some divorced, some widowed, some separated decades ago, quietly carried the same invisible questions. Questions they rarely share because they feared others wouldn't understand. Questions that science, psychology, and even history had struggled to explain for generations. Because why do some people forget and others never do? Why can two people experience the same relationship and leave with completely different scars? Why does one person seem to move forward effortlessly while the other spends years haunted by memories they never invited back? Ethan often wondered if something was wrong with him. He saw friends remarry. He watched old classmates post pictures with new families. Life appeared to move on for everyone else. Yet every now and then, especially in quiet moments, Amelia would somehow return. Not physically, but through memories, dreams, and strange reminders hidden inside ordinary life. And perhaps even stranger was the pain itself. Because heartbreak wasn't supposed to hurt like this. At least, that's what Ethan used to believe. He expected sadness. He expected loneliness. But no one warned him about the physical exhaustion. No one explained the sleepless nights, the racing thoughts, the strange heaviness that seemed to live inside his chest. There were days when he felt tired for no reason. Nights when anxiety appeared without warning. Mornings when he woke up exhausted before the day had even begun. And this led him to another question that countless broken hearts have asked throughout history. Why does heartbreak hurt physically? Why does losing someone feel less like sadness and more like surviving an injury nobody else can see? Could the human mind really experience emotional pain in ways so powerful that the body itself begins to suffer? And if that were true, then perhaps heartbreak was never just an emotion. Perhaps it was something much deeper. Then there was another mystery Ethan couldn't understand. Why do certain people return years later? Why did stories of old lovers reconnecting after decades seem to happen so often? Why did some people spend years apart only to discover they had never truly stopped thinking about one another? He had heard stories from old friends, stories of high school sweethearts reunited after 30 years, stories of widowers finding old letters, stories of chance encounters that changed lives. Was it fate? Coincidence? Loneliness? Or was there something inside the human heart that refused to completely let go? And if memories could survive years, even decades, then perhaps love itself was more complicated than anyone understood. Which raised another question. Was love really just chemistry? Was it nothing more than hormones and brain chemicals? Temporary emotions designed to come and go? Or was there something deeper happening beneath the surface? Something that science could measure, but perhaps never fully explain? Because if love were merely chemistry, why did some people spend the rest of their lives remembering one person? Why could a scent, a song, or a familiar street bring tears to someone's eyes 50 years later? Why did old memories sometimes feel more alive than present realities? Ethan wasn't searching for philosophical answers. He simply wanted peace. But the more he searched, the more questions appeared. And one question disturbed him more than all the others. Why do people chase those who hurt them? Why do broken hearts often long for the very person who caused their pain? Why do people reopen old messages, revisit old places, and secretly hope for impossible conversations? Why does absence seem to magnify love instead of erase it? It didn't make sense. Yet millions of people lived through the same experience. People who knew they deserved peace, but found themselves trapped by memories they couldn't explain. As the months turned into years, Ethan became fascinated by another possibility. Could a broken heart actually change the brain itself? Could grief, loneliness, and lost love reshape the way people think, feel, and remember? Researchers had spent years studying these questions, uncovering discoveries that surprised even them. They found that heartbreak activates some of the same regions of the brain associated with physical pain. They discovered that memories become stronger after emotional loss. They learned that loneliness changes stress hormones and affects sleep, appetite, and even the body's immune system. Suddenly, Ethan began seeing his own suffering differently. Maybe he wasn't weak. Maybe he wasn't failing to move on. Maybe what he was experiencing was something millions of human beings had experienced throughout history, something that connected strangers across generations. And yet, despite all the science and all the explanations, one mystery remained. Why do we fall in love in the first place? Why do complete strangers become the center of our worlds? Why do ordinary moments become memories we carry forever? And why does one person among billions suddenly become the person whose voice can stop time itself? Ethan Parker didn't know it yet, but to understand why heartbreak changes people, he first had to understand why love changes them. Because before we understand heartbreak, we must first understand why we fall in love in the first place. And what Ethan would eventually discover about the beginning of love would reveal truths far more powerful than anything he thought he knew. Long before Ethan Parker found himself replaying old voicemails in the middle of the night, before he would spend years asking questions that had no easy answers, there was something he shared with millions of people across America. The same excitement, the same hope, the same belief that this time would be different. And Ethan wasn't alone. More than 800 miles away in Arizona, 61-year-old Michael Bennett remembered the exact moment he first saw Emily. He still laughed about it years later. He had gone into a coffee shop expecting nothing more than a quiet morning, and somehow left with a smile he couldn't explain. In North Carolina, 54-year-old David Carter could still remember receiving his first message from Olivia. He had stared at his phone like a teenager, smiling at words that today seemed almost ordinary. And in Colorado, 58-year-old Robert Walker remembered spending 3 hours talking to Hannah on the phone one evening, only to realize neither of them wanted to say goodnight. Different men, different states, different backgrounds, yet they all experienced something remarkably similar. The excitement, the late-night conversations, the endless messages, the hope that perhaps life had one more beautiful chapter waiting for them. They saved pictures. They shared memories. They imagined vacations. They talked about retirement, grandchildren, and growing old together. Family photos began including new faces. Birthdays became special again. Wedding videos from years past were replaced by fresh memories. Phone galleries filled with smiling pictures, ordinary moments, and messages saying things like, "Good morning, sweetheart," and "I can't wait to see you tonight." Looking back, all of them would later say the same thing. They weren't searching for perfection. They were searching for connection. And when they found it, life suddenly felt brighter. Ethan Parker remembered those feelings with painful clarity. Amelia had a way of making ordinary days feel meaningful. Sometimes they spent entire evenings doing nothing important at all, yet somehow those became the memories he cherished most. There were road trips with no destination, quiet dinners, conversations that stretched late into the night, Sundays spent laughing at old movies, text messages that simply said, "Thinking about you." Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary. Yet somehow those small moments created something powerful. Looking through old photographs years later, Ethan often found himself smiling before the sadness arrived. There they were on a beach vacation in Florida, laughing over something neither of them could remember. There was a Christmas picture with Amelia wearing the ugly sweater Ethan had bought as a joke. There were screenshots of old text messages he had forgotten existed, tiny reminders of promises, dreams, and jokes that once felt eternal. Michael Bennett had the same memories. So did David Carter. So did Robert Walker. Different women, different stories, yet the same feeling, the same excitement that made them check their phones every few minutes. The same joy that turned ordinary days into memories worth keeping. And perhaps the strangest part of all was that none of them knew exactly why they felt so alive. They only knew they did. Because when people fall in love, something incredible happens inside the brain. Scientists have spent decades studying this mystery, and what they discovered surprised even them. Love activates powerful chemicals, especially dopamine, often called the brain's reward chemical. The same system responsible for motivation, pleasure, and anticipation begins working overtime. Suddenly, a message from one person becomes more exciting than anything else. Their voice brings comfort. Their smile becomes familiar. Their attention feels valuable. And without realizing it, people begin building emotional bonds stronger than they ever imagined. But dopamine alone couldn't explain everything. Because if love was only chemistry, then why did memories survive long after relationships ended? Why did people like Ethan still remember details years later? Why could Michael Bennett remember Emily's laugh, David Carter remember Olivia's perfume, and Robert Walker remember Hannah's voice as though it belonged to yesterday? The answer, researchers discovered, had something to do with attachment. Human beings are wired for connection. From the day we are born, we seek safety, affection, and belonging. Love doesn't simply make people happy. It creates emotional homes, places inside other people where we feel understood, accepted, and safe. And once those homes are built, they become part of who we are. That is why love often feels addictive. Not because people are weak, but because connection itself is one of the most powerful needs the human brain possesses. It explains why lovers wait by the phone, why they replay conversations, why they smile at simple messages, why hearing one person's voice can change the entire mood of a day. Ethan Parker experienced it. Michael Bennett experienced it. David Carter experienced it. Robert Walker experienced it. And millions of others experienced it too. Which is why heartbreak feels so devastating. Because losing someone isn't simply losing a person. It feels like losing a future, losing routines, losing dreams, losing a part of ourselves that became intertwined with another soul. But back then, none of them knew any of this. They weren't thinking about endings. They weren't worried about loss. They were too busy making plans, taking pictures, sharing dreams, and believing they had found something that would last forever. And perhaps that is what makes love both beautiful and heartbreaking. Nobody enters it expecting pain. Nobody begins by imagining goodbyes. Nobody takes vacation photos thinking they will one day become memories too painful to revisit. Because what none of them knew was that love wasn't preparing them for happiness. It was preparing them for loss. And before Ethan Parker, Michael Bennett, David Carter, and Robert Walker would understand why broken hearts hurt so deeply, life would first teach them a lesson none of them were prepared to learn. Because the greatest changes rarely announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive quietly, hidden inside ordinary days, disguised as small misunderstandings and unspoken words. And by the time anyone realizes what is happening, the distance has already begun. None of them saw it happening at first. That was perhaps the cruelest part. Relationships rarely collapse in dramatic fashion. More often, they change quietly. So quietly that by the time anyone realizes something is wrong, the distance has already settled in. Ethan Parker and Amelia still ate dinner together, but the conversations that once stretched late into the evening became shorter. There were no more dreams being discussed, no more spontaneous road trips, no more laughter over small things. Silence began filling spaces that words once occupied. Michael Bennett noticed Emily checking her phone more than she listened. David Carter and Olivia stopped saying good night before falling asleep. Robert Walker found himself sitting alone in the living room, while Hannah preferred spending evenings in another room. None of these moments seemed important by themselves. But relationships are rarely destroyed by one giant mistake. They are changed by thousands of tiny moments nobody notices until they start adding up. Arguments became more frequent. Not explosive arguments, just little disagreements that somehow lasted longer than they should. Misunderstandings became common. Someone stopped asking questions. Someone stopped listening. Someone stopped trying. And slowly, painfully, the person who once knew your soul better than anyone else began feeling strangely unfamiliar. It was almost impossible to explain. How could someone who knew your favorite songs, your fears, your dreams, suddenly feel like a stranger? Yet that's exactly what happened. The dining room table where Ethan and Amelia once laughed over Sunday breakfast became a place of quiet meals. Unanswered phone calls became more common. Text messages that once arrived within minutes took hours. Then came entire evenings spent alone. Nights when one person fell asleep before the other came home. Nights when sleeping beside someone somehow felt lonelier than sleeping alone. Michael Bennett remembered the day Emily left her wedding ring on the bathroom counter and forgot to put it back on. It wasn't intentional, but he stared at it for several minutes, feeling something he couldn't explain. David Carter remembered sitting at dinner while Olivia scrolled through her phone, barely noticing his words. Robert Walker remembered asking Hannah if everything was okay, only to hear the answer he dreaded most. I'm Fina. Those two words, so simple, yet sometimes they carry entire oceans of distance. Looking back years later, each man asked himself the same question. Was this the moment the relationship died? Or had it been dying for years while neither of us noticed? Because perhaps the saddest thing about losing someone isn't the goodbye itself. Perhaps it's realizing the goodbye began long before either person knew it. And then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, everything ended. Ethan Parker would remember that Tuesday morning for the rest of his life. There were no warning sirens, no dramatic signs, just coffee growing cold on the table and Amelia sitting quietly across from him with tears filling her eyes. He had seen sadness before, but this was different. This wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was resignation. And somehow that frightened him more. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke. Ethan, I don't know how to do this anymore. He stared at her, waiting for the conversation that every couple eventually has. The difficult conversation. The one you survive. But then came the words he never expected. I don't love you anymore. At first, he thought he had heard her wrong. He looked at her, searching for signs of uncertainty. But Amelia simply lowered her eyes and whispered, I need space. There was a long silence neither of them knew how to fill. And then came the sentence that changed everything. It's over. 3 words. 3 ordinary words. Yet in less than a second, they shattered 4 years of memories, dreams, routines, and promises. Ethan sat there unable to speak, unable to understand how someone who once held his hand and promised forever could now sit across from him like a stranger. He wanted answers. He wanted explanations. He wanted one more chance. But Amelia had already spent months saying goodbye inside her own heart. For Ethan, the breakup started that morning. For Amelia, it had started long before. And while Ethan Parker sat frozen in disbelief, Michael Bennett was experiencing his own ending. Emily left after a short phone call that lasted less than 10 minutes. David Carter received a message from Olivia while sitting in his office. Robert Walker found Hannah's letter waiting beside the kitchen sink. Different endings, different women, yet the same unbearable silence followed each one. Suddenly, empty houses became unbearable. Beds felt too large. Familiar routines became reminders. And the strangest thing happened. The world kept moving. Cars still passed by. People still laughed. Stores still opened. Yet for them, time itself felt broken. Friends said things like, you'll be okay. Family members told them to move on. But nobody could explain why the pain felt so physical. Why eating became difficult. Why sleep disappeared. Why anxiety arrived without warning. Because scientists would later discover something remarkable. Heartbreak activates many of the same brain regions associated with physical pain. In other words, emotional pain is not imaginary. The brain responds to rejection and loss in ways strikingly similar to injury. Which explains why Ethan's chest felt heavy. Why Michael lost 20 pounds. Why David woke up at 3 in the morning every night. Why Robert spent hours staring at old photographs without realizing time had passed. They weren't weak. They weren't broken. They were injured in ways nobody could see. And perhaps no group suffers more quietly than men between the ages of 45 and 64. Raised to stay strong. Taught not to cry. Conditioned to carry pain without speaking about it. Ethan told his friends he was fine. Michael joked about being single again. David buried himself in work. Robert smiled whenever people asked how he was doing. But behind closed doors, the truth was very different. Loneliness began creeping into their lives like an unwanted visitor. Meals were skipped. Sleep became fragmented. Television played in empty rooms simply to avoid silence. Birthdays became difficult. Holidays became painful reminders. And loneliness, researchers discovered, can become dangerous. Studies showed that chronic loneliness affects the heart, weakens the immune system, increases anxiety, and raises the risk of depression. Human beings are built for connection, and when that connection disappears, the body often suffers alongside the mind. Ethan Parker learned this firsthand. There were nights when he sat inside his car, simply because he couldn't bear walking into an empty house. Michael Bennett spent entire weekends without speaking to another person. David Carter stopped answering calls from friends. Robert Walker convinced himself he preferred being alone when the truth was much more painful. He was afraid of being hurt again, afraid nobody would understand, afraid that perhaps the best years of his life were behind him. Yet something extraordinary happened afterward, something none of them expected, something that surprised even psychologists who had spent decades studying love and heartbreak. Because while the world assumed they would slowly forget and move on, what happened next revealed something far more fascinating about memory, healing, and the incredible resilience of the human heart. And what Ethan Parker would discover in the years that followed would change everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the strange ways broken hearts sometimes find their way back to life. For Ethan Parker, the night everything truly became real wasn't the Tuesday morning when Amelia sat across from him with tears in her eyes. It was later, much later, long after she had packed her things, long after the front door closed, long after the sound of her car disappeared into the distance. Because during the first few hours, his mind refused to accept what had happened. He wandered through the house, almost mechanically. He washed dishes that didn't need washing. He folded blankets that didn't need folding. He sat in front of the television without remembering what he was watching. Part of him believed she would call and say she made a mistake. Part of him believed this was simply another difficult chapter and not the end of the story. But then, just after midnight, his phone lit up. For one brief second, hope returned. His heart raced. His hands trembled. But it wasn't Amelia. It was a friend checking on him. Ethan stared at the screen for several seconds before setting it down. And that's when reality finally arrived. The silence. The unbearable silence. It wrapped itself around every room in the house. Her coffee mug was still beside the sink. Her sweater still hung near the bedroom door. Her perfume lingered in the hallway. And for the first time since they met, Ethan understood something terrifying. Tomorrow morning, she wouldn't be there. The woman whose voice had become part of his daily life was gone. And somehow the world outside continued as if nothing had happened. Cars still passed. People still laughed. Restaurants still served dinner. But inside Ethan Parker, something had broken. 800 miles away, Michael Bennett experienced the same devastation. His phone rang that evening, and for 10 minutes, he listened to Emily explain why she was leaving. She wasn't angry. There was no screaming, just tears and painful honesty. At the end of the conversation, she whispered words Michael would replay in his head for years. "I don't love you anymore." There was a long pause. Then she added softly, "I need space." And finally, with a trembling voice, she said, "It's over." David Carter didn't even get a conversation. Sitting alone inside his office after everyone had gone home, he received a message from Olivia. 3 sentences. 3 sentences ending 12 years together. Robert Walker returned home to find a letter waiting on the kitchen counter. He read it 3 times before understanding what it meant. Different endings, different women, different states. Yet the same devastating question echoed inside each man's mind. How can someone who once promised forever suddenly become a stranger? And perhaps even more painful, how do you continue living when the future you imagine disappears overnight? They all reacted differently. Ethan sat in darkness for hours. Michael drove around the city until sunrise because he couldn't bear returning home. David stared at old photographs while refusing to answer calls. Robert slept on the couch because the bed felt too empty, and nobody saw them cry. Nobody heard them whisper impossible prayers in empty rooms. Nobody knew how often they reached for their phones before remembering there was nobody left to call. What made everything even more confusing was that the pain wasn't only emotional. Ethan's chest felt heavy. Michael lost his appetite. David couldn't sleep more than 2 hours without waking up. Robert felt exhausted every day despite doing almost nothing. They wondered if something was wrong with them. But researchers studying Heartbreak discovered something remarkable. Emotional pain activates many of the same brain regions involved in physical pain. In other words, heartbreak isn't simply sadness. The brain experiences rejection and loss in ways surprisingly similar to injury. That's why people describe heartbreak as feeling crushed. That's why the chest tightens. That's why sleep disappears. That's why memories become sharper. The pain is real. Invisible perhaps, but real. And no group experiences this quiet suffering more deeply than men between 45 and 64. A generation raised to remain strong. A generation taught to provide, endure, and carry burdens without complaint. Ethan Parker never told anyone how many nights he cried inside his car because he couldn't stand the silence waiting inside his house. Michael Bennett smiled at work while secretly eating dinner alone every night. David Carter buried himself in business meetings because they distracted him from loneliness. Robert Walker pretended he enjoyed being alone when the truth was much more painful. He was afraid. Afraid he would never love again. Afraid the best years of his life had already passed. Afraid that nobody would understand. So they suffered quietly, like millions of men across America. Men who smile during the day and stare at ceilings at night. Men who answer, "I'm fine," while carrying wounds nobody sees. And loneliness, scientists discovered, is far more dangerous than most people realize. Prolonged loneliness affects the immune system. It increases anxiety. It raises stress hormones. It disrupts sleep. It can even affect heart health. Human beings are designed for connection. And when connection disappears, the body suffers alongside the mind. Ethan Parker experienced this firsthand. There were days when he forgot to eat, nights when he drove around aimlessly because going home felt unbearable. Michael Bennett stopped answering friends. David Carter avoided family gatherings. Robert Walker spent entire weekends without hearing another person's voice. Yet something strange happened in the months and years that followed. Something none of them expected. Something that surprised even psychologists who had spent decades studying grief and human relationships. Because while everyone around them assumed time would simply erase the pain, something far more fascinating began happening inside their minds. Memories they thought would disappear became stronger. Certain songs carried unusual power. Forgotten photographs suddenly reappeared. Dreams became strangely vivid. And years after the breakups, moments arrived that none of them could explain. Moments that made them question everything they thought they understood about love, memory, and healing. But what happened afterwards shocked even psychologists. Because what these men eventually discovered revealed something extraordinary about the human heart. Something that would forever change the way Ethan Parker understood loss, and perhaps explain why some people leave our lives but never truly leave us. In the weeks that followed, life did not stop for Ethan Parker, Michael Bennett, David Carter, or Robert Walker. Bills still had to be paid. Cars still needed gas. Friends still expected smiles. The world outside moved forward with remarkable indifference. But inside, something had changed forever. And what psychologists have observed for decades began happening in their lives. 3 paths slowly emerged. Some men become angry. Some become depressed. And some somehow rebuild. But no one begins by rebuilding. First comes the confusion. Then comes the silence. Then comes the long nights when sleep refuses to arrive. Ethan Parker discovered this quickly. The first few months after Amelia left were unlike anything he had ever experienced. He would wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and stare at the ceiling for hours. Every room in the house reminded him of something. The kitchen where they laughed. The couch where they watched movies. The hallway where she would kiss him goodbye before work. Memories became both comfort and punishment. Some nights he replayed old conversations in his head, searching for clues he missed. Other nights he blamed himself for everything. He wondered if he should have listened more, loved differently, tried harder. And perhaps the cruelest companion after heartbreak isn't sadness. It's regret, because regret has a way of rewriting history. It convinces us that one different choice could have changed everything. And once that thought enters the mind, it rarely leaves quietly. Michael Bennett's story took a darker turn. At 61 years old, he had spent decades building a life with Emily. Their finances were intertwined. Their retirement plans were shared. Their dreams belonged to both of them. When she left, Michael didn't just lose a relationship. He lost the future he had spent years imagining. The divorce drained his savings. He sold a house they had lived in for 17 years. He moved into a small apartment and told everyone he preferred it that way. But the truth was much harder. He wasn't just grieving Emily. He was grieving the man he used to be. He stopped going to church. He stopped seeing friends. He stopped answering messages. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Eventually, loneliness became his routine. People assumed he was healing because he stopped talking about the breakup. But silence isn't always healing. Sometimes silence is surrender. Michael later admitted that there were nights when he sat alone in his apartment and questioned whether life still held anything meaningful. He never spoke those thoughts aloud. Like so many men of his generation, he carried them quietly, smiled when necessary, nodded when asked if he was okay. But deep inside, he felt invisible. He had lost more than money. He had lost purpose. And without purpose, even ordinary days can begin to feel unbearably heavy. David Carter nearly became another statistic. At 54, he buried himself in work. 12-hour days became 14-hour days. Weekends disappeared. His office became his home. Colleagues admired his dedication, unaware that work had become an escape. Because when he stopped moving, memories arrived. Olivia's voice, their vacations, their plans, their promises. So he stayed busy. But grief doesn't disappear simply because we ignore it. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with him. Sleep became impossible. Anxiety followed. And one night, sitting alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home, David broke down. For the first time in his life, he admitted something terrifying. He wasn't okay. And strangely, that admission became the beginning of his survival. He sought counseling, something he once believed only other people needed. He began talking honestly with friends. He started exercising again. Slowly, painfully, life returned. Not all at once, not dramatically, but little by little. And then there was Robert Walker, the man nobody expected to change. The quiet 58-year-old who spent months convincing himself his life was over. After Hannah left, Robert disappeared from almost everyone. Yet somewhere inside his loneliness, something unexpected happened. He began walking in the mornings simply because he couldn't sleep. Those walks turned into habits. Habits became routines. Routines became changes. He lost weight. He reconnected with old friends. He traveled. He volunteered. He rediscovered hobbies he had abandoned decades earlier. And perhaps for the first time in his life, Robert stopped living for someone else's expectations and started asking himself what he actually wanted. People who hadn't seen him in years barely recognized him. Not because he looked younger, but because he looked alive again. And Ethan Parker stood somewhere between all three paths. Some days he was angry. Angry at himself. Angry at fate. Angry that Amelia had moved on while he remained trapped in memories. Other days, depression settled over him like a heavy blanket. There were moments he felt like a stranger inside his own life. Because heartbreak doesn't only take away people. Sometimes it takes away identities. Who was Ethan Parker without Amelia? Who was Michael Bennett without Emily? Who was David Carter without Olivia? Who was Robert Walker without Hannah? These weren't just broken relationships. These were identity crises. Men who had spent years defining themselves through shared dreams suddenly found themselves alone with questions they had avoided asking. Midlife loneliness became more than solitude. It became a mirror, and mirrors can be frightening because eventually they force us to ask questions we don't want to answer. Am I enough? Can I love again? Is this all that's left? Did I waste my best years? Those questions haunted all four men. Yet something remarkable became impossible to ignore. They had experienced similar heartbreaks, similar losses, similar loneliness. Yet their futures were becoming very different. Michael lost almost everything. David nearly gave up. Robert transformed his life. Ethan remained caught somewhere in between, which raised a question that researchers, therapists, and broken hearts have wrestled with for generations. Why does one man break while another rises? Why do some people become prisoners of their pain, while others somehow find meaning inside it? The answer, Ethan Parker would eventually discover, had nothing to do with strength, age, or luck. It had everything to do with something far more mysterious. Because buried inside heartbreak itself was a secret few people understood, and what science would eventually reveal about memory, love, and the human brain would surprise even the men living through it. Because the greatest mystery wasn't why they suffered. The greatest mystery was why, even after years had passed, certain memories refused to let go. Years after Amelia left, Ethan Parker still couldn't understand one thing. Why, after all that time, could a random song playing inside a grocery store suddenly bring tears to his eyes? Why could the smell of cinnamon remind him of Christmas mornings with Amelia? Why could driving past a small diner on the edge of town transport him back to Sunday breakfasts they shared years earlier? He wasn't trying to remember. In fact, he spent years trying not to. Yet memories seemed to arrive without permission. And the more he fought them, the stronger they became. Michael Bennett experienced the same thing when an old photograph slipped out of a drawer while he was cleaning his apartment. David Carter found himself sitting motionless after hearing a song Olivia used to play during long road trips. Robert Walker once drove 2 hours to visit a lake where he and Hannah had spent a weekend nearly 15 years earlier. None of them understood why these moments held so much power. They wondered if something was wrong with them. They wondered why their minds refused to move on. But what researchers eventually discovered changed the way psychologists understood heartbreak forever. Because losing someone isn't simply emotional pain. The brain treats heartbreak in ways remarkably similar to withdrawal from addiction. Studies showed that when people lose someone they deeply love, the same reward systems once flooded by affection, connection, and anticipation suddenly experience deprivation. The brain, which had grown accustomed to that person's voice, touch, routines, and presence, reacts almost like someone deprived of something essential. Suddenly, memories become cravings. Familiar places become reminders. Songs become emotional triggers. And that's why moving on often feels less like forgetting and more like surviving withdrawal. Ethan Parker wasn't weak. Michael Bennett wasn't broken. David Carter wasn't failing. They were experiencing something millions of human beings have endured throughout history. Their brains were grieving. And strangely, separation often makes memories stronger instead of weaker. Scientists studying memory found something remarkable. When relationships end, emotional experiences are often preserved with unusual intensity. Moments that once seemed ordinary become precious. Conversations long forgotten suddenly return with extraordinary clarity. That's why Ethan could still remember the way Amelia laughed when she spilled coffee on herself during their trip to Florida. That's why Michael Bennett remembered the exact song playing when Emily kissed him for the first time. That's why David Carter still remembered Olivia falling asleep beside him during long drives. That's why Robert Walker could still picture Hannah standing beside a lake with the wind blowing through her hair. Time should have erased these memories. But instead, absence seemed to preserve them. And loneliness itself creates changes few people understand. Studies revealed that prolonged loneliness increases stress hormones and inflammation throughout the body. It affects sleep, appetite, concentration, and even heart health. Human beings are built for connection. And when that connection disappears, the body responds in ways that are both emotional and physical. Ethan Parker noticed it during his sleepless nights. Michael Bennett experienced it through exhaustion and anxiety. David Carter felt it during the long hours when work no longer distracted him. And Robert Walker discovered it in moments of silence when memories appeared stronger than reality itself. Yet perhaps the strangest part of all was how ordinary things became powerful emotional keys. Songs, smells, old restaurants, photographs, even seasons. Autumn reminded Ethan of Amelia, because that's when they met. Summer reminded Michael of Emily, because they always vacationed together. Christmas brought David memories of Olivia. Rainy evenings reminded Robert of Hannah. The mind creates associations that survive long after people leave, which explains why one familiar scent or one forgotten melody can instantly awaken emotions buried for years. Memories are not simply stored. They are woven into places, sounds, and experiences. And once those connections are formed, they become part of us. But perhaps the greatest misunderstanding about heartbreak is this. People believe they only miss the person. Yet that's rarely the whole truth. Ethan Parker eventually realized he wasn't only missing Amelia. He was missing the future they planned together. The retirement trips, the grandchildren they talked about, the quiet evenings they imagined sharing decades later. Michael Bennett wasn't only grieving Emily. He was grieving routines, Saturday mornings, shared meals, familiar voices inside an empty house. David Carter discovered he wasn't just missing Olivia. He was missing the version of himself that existed when she was there. The man who laughed more. The man who believed he had endless time. Robert Walker understood that he wasn't only mourning Hannah. He was mourning the identity they built together. Because when relationships end, something deeper often disappears. We don't just lose people. We lose dreams. We lose routines. We lose versions of ourselves that existed within those relationships. And perhaps that explains why heartbreak feels so devastating. It isn't just one loss. It's many losses happening all at once. Yet something remarkable emerged from decades of research and thousands of stories like Ethan's. Something so surprising that even psychologists struggle to explain it. Because while heartbreak wounds people, it also changes them. Sometimes in painful ways, sometimes in beautiful ways, and sometimes the very suffering people desperately try to avoid becomes the thing that transforms their lives forever. Which raises an extraordinary possibility. What if heartbreak isn't simply destruction? What if loss serves another purpose entirely? Because perhaps the greatest surprise isn't why we suffer. It's why heartbreak may actually save us. For a long time, Ethan Parker believed heartbreak had ruined his life. He believed Amelia's departure had taken something from him that could never be replaced. And perhaps, for a while, he was right. Because grief changes people, loss changes people, pain changes people. But what Ethan would eventually discover was something no one had ever told him. Heartbreak doesn't only break us. Sometimes, it introduces us to people we have neglected for years. Ourselves. Somewhere between sleepless nights and quiet mornings, between loneliness and memories, life began moving again. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just slowly. Michael Bennett, the man who had lost almost everything, eventually stopped measuring his life by what he had lost and started asking himself what remained. He had spent decades working for someone else, postponing dreams because there was always time later. After Emily left, he found himself with too much silence and nowhere to hide. One afternoon, almost by accident, he started repairing old furniture in his garage. It was something his father had taught him when he was young. Friends noticed his work and encouraged him to sell pieces online. Months later, what began as a distraction became a business. It wasn't about money. It was about purpose. For the first time in years, Michael woke up excited about something again. Not because Emily came back, but because life had. David Carter, the man who nearly gave up, discovered something even more surprising. During his darkest period, his relationship with his son had nearly disappeared. Years of long work hours and emotional distance had created walls neither of them knew how to tear down. One evening, after months of avoiding difficult conversations, David called his son and simply said, "I miss you." It was the beginning of something neither of them expected. Slowly, they rebuilt what had been neglected. Sunday lunches returned. Long conversations followed. And years later, David would say something remarkable. Losing Olivia forced him to repair relationships he had forgotten were broken. Robert Walker, the quiet man everyone thought was finished, transformed himself in ways nobody anticipated. His morning walks became daily routines. Daily routines became discipline. Discipline became confidence. He lost nearly 60 pounds. He started traveling. He laughed again. And one day, during a volunteer event at a local shelter, he met someone who made him smile in a way he hadn't smiled in years. There were no grand promises. No desperate expectations. Just peace. Real peace. And perhaps for the first time in his life, Robert understood the difference between needing someone and appreciating someone. Ethan Parker's journey unfolded differently. He didn't start a business. He didn't dramatically reinvent himself. Instead, he slowly rediscovered parts of himself he had abandoned. He returned to church after years away, not because he was searching for answers, but because he needed quiet. He reconnected with old friends. He learned to enjoy mornings alone without feeling abandoned. He stopped asking why Amelia left and began asking who he wanted to become. And something extraordinary happened. The man who once feared being alone began finding peace in his own company. The silence that once terrified him slowly became a friend. The memories no longer arrived like wounds. They arrived like chapters. And one evening, while reading a book he had almost ignored for years, Ethan came across a quote that stopped him in his tracks. "The wound is where the light enters you." He read the sentence again and again. Suddenly, everything made sense. Maybe the pain wasn't punishment. Maybe it was preparation. Maybe losing someone wasn't always the end of life. Sometimes losing someone is how we find ourselves. Because heartbreak forces transformation. It strips away distractions. It reveals priorities. It exposes neglected relationships. It reminds us that time is precious. And perhaps that is why some people emerge from heartbreak stronger than before. Not because they wanted suffering, but because suffering forced them to become people they never would have become otherwise. Michael Bennett found purpose. David Carter repaired his family. Robert Walker rediscovered joy. And Ethan Parker discovered peace. None of them would have chosen pain. Yet all of them became different because of it. And maybe that's why some of life's greatest gifts arrive disguised as losses. Maybe what breaks us also reveals us. Maybe what hurts us teaches us. And maybe healing isn't about forgetting. Maybe it's about becoming. 3 years after Amelia left, Ethan Parker found himself sitting alone in his car outside a grocery store parking lot at 2:17 in the morning. The same place where this story began. His phone illuminated the darkness. There it was. The old voicemail he had kept for years. A piece of the past he once feared deleting. Slowly, he pressed play. He listened to Amelia's voice one final time. The familiar laughter, the affection, the warmth that had once defined his world. Years earlier, that voice would have shattered him. Years earlier, it would have sent him into another night of regrets and unanswered questions. But something had changed. The memories no longer carried bitterness. They no longer demanded answers. They simply existed. And as the voicemail ended, Ethan sat quietly. No tears, no anger, no longing, just gratitude. Then, with a gentle smile, he whispered words he never thought he would say. "Thank you." Not because Amelia came back. She never did. Not because the pain hadn't been real. It was not because he stopped loving her. Some part of him probably always would. But because losing her forced him to become the man he should have been all along. The man who learned that peace doesn't come from another person. The man who discovered that loneliness isn't the absence of love. It's the absence of connection with ourselves. The man who finally understood that love isn't measured by who stayed. It's measured by who you became after they left. And perhaps that's the truth so many broken hearts spend years searching for. Maybe the greatest love story of your life isn't the one that begins with another person. Maybe it's the one that begins when you finally learn to love yourself. Because people will leave. Time will change things. Seasons will come and go. But the relationship you have with yourself is the one story that follows you until the end. And perhaps tonight, somewhere, someone listening to this story is sitting alone with memories they don't understand. Someone who thinks life ended when a person walked away. Someone who believes they lost the best years of their life. If that's you, then maybe Ethan Parker's story was never really about heartbreak. Maybe it was about hope. Maybe it was about survival. Maybe it was about discovering that endings often become beginnings in disguise. So let me leave you with this question. What lesson did heartbreak teach you? And if you could sit across from your younger self, just before your greatest heartbreak, what would you say? Tell us in the comments below, because your story might help someone who's hurting tonight. And if you thought this story was powerful, wait until you hear what happened in our next documentary, The Loneliness Epidemic, Why Millions of Men Are Suffering in Silence. Because sometimes the stories we never tell are the ones that need to be heard the most. 3 years later, on a quiet Tuesday night, Ethan Parker found himself back in the same parking lot where so many lonely nights had passed. The dashboard clock read 2:17 in the morning. The grocery store across the street was closed. The city around him had fallen asleep. And for the first time in years, there was no heaviness in his chest. No anxiety. No questions demanding answers. Only silence. A different kind of silence. Not the kind that had once frightened him. Not the kind that used to follow him into empty rooms and sleepless nights. This silence felt peaceful, almost familiar. His phone illuminated the darkness inside the car. And there it was. The voicemail. Amelia's voicemail. The one message he had refused to delete for 3 years. The one piece of the past he had carried through birthdays, holidays, lonely winters, and quiet mornings. A part of him had always believed he kept it because he still needed her. But sitting there in the darkness, Ethan finally understood something. He had never kept the voicemail because he was waiting for Amelia. He had kept it because he was afraid of saying goodbye to the man he used to be. Slowly, he pressed play. Her voice filled the car once more. Familiar. Gentle. Warm. She laughed halfway through the message, just like she always did. Years ago, hearing that laugh would have broken him. It would have ruined his sleep. It would have sent him searching through photographs and old messages. But now, as the message ended, Ethan simply sat there quietly. No tears. No pain. No bitterness. Just gratitude. Then he smiled, and almost in a whisper, he said 2 words he never thought he would say. Thank you. Not because Amelia came back. She never did. Not because he stopped loving her. Some people leave fingerprints on our hearts that time never completely erases. And perhaps that's okay. No. Ethan whispered thank you because losing her had forced him to become the man he should have been all along. The man who learned how to sit alone without feeling lonely. The man who stopped measuring his worth by who stayed and who left. The man who rediscovered old friendships, rebuilt his faith, and found joy in ordinary mornings. The man who no longer needed someone else's love to believe he deserved love. Because somewhere between heartbreak and healing, Ethan had discovered something that changed everything. Love isn't measured by who stayed. It's measured by who you became after they left. Michael Bennett had discovered that purpose mattered more than possessions. David Carter had repaired a relationship with his son that he almost lost forever. Robert Walker had found peace and laughter again. And Ethan Parker had found something even more valuable. Himself. And perhaps that was the irony hidden inside every broken heart. The ending we fear most often becomes the beginning we never expected. Because sometimes losing someone is not the tragedy. Sometimes losing someone is the invitation. The invitation to finally stop running, to stop proving, to stop waiting, and to begin living again. Not because the pain disappears, but because life slowly teaches us that pain and peace can exist together. Memories and healing can exist together. Love and goodbye can exist together. And perhaps that is what growing older teaches us. Not how to avoid heartbreak, but how to survive it without losing ourselves. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest love story of your life isn't the one that started with another person. Maybe the greatest love story of your life is the one that begins the moment you finally learn to love yourself. The moment you stop chasing what left and start appreciating what remains. The moment you realize that being alone isn't the same as being abandoned. The moment you discover that peace feels better than proving anything to anyone. Because the truth is, everyone listening to this story carries a memory, a face, a voice, a chapter they never expected to end. Some of you listening tonight still have photographs hidden away. Some of you still remember birthdays. Some of you still wonder what might have been. And maybe that's what makes us human. Not that we forget, but that we learn how to carry memories without allowing them to carry us. So before we say goodbye, let me ask you something. What lesson did heartbreak teach you? And if you could sit across from your younger self, just before your greatest heartbreak, knowing everything you know now, what would you say? Would you tell yourself not to love? Or would you smile and say, love anyway? Because even though it will hurt, it will also teach you who you are. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Because somewhere out there, someone who can't sleep tonight may read your story and realize they aren't alone. Your words might become hope for someone who's quietly suffering. And if this story touched your heart, wait until you hear what happened in our next documentary, The Loneliness Epidemic, Why Millions of Men Are Suffering in Silence. Because some of the deepest wounds are the ones nobody sees. And some of the most powerful stories are the ones people are afraid to tell. Until then, keep moving forward. Keep healing. Keep believing. Because life has a remarkable way of giving light back to those who thought they had lost it forever. And sometimes, after everything falls apart, we finally become the people we were always meant to be.